Hello, my name is Jason Ford, and I'm the Director of Instructional Support here at Spartanburg Community College, and today we're going to be talking about presenting professionally. We're going to take a look at understanding the ology of slides and presenting. But before we begin, I just sort of want to help frame this just a bit. Many of us probably enjoy going to go see a feature presentation, a movie. We get there, we enjoy seeing all the visuals, the action, the CGI effects, the soundtracks, the actors, everything else. And it just makes for an amazing experience. Now imagine if you paid your $10 or $13 to go to such a presentation, and when you got there, instead of all those fancy visuals and everything else, they simply displayed the script up on the screen and had someone off to the side read it. Yeah, definitely not something you'd want to see or would be interested in, yet this is the exact same thing we do on a regular basis for our audiences, whether they're students or at conferences. So that's what we hope to change inside this presentation. So let's go and take a look. Alright, so this presentation is going to cover three things. The first thing that we're going to take a look at is your audience. Understanding who your audience is and how they basically interpret the information they see in a multimedia presentation. Knowing how they think and how they retain that information can really help you design your slides to be better. The second thing we're going to take a look at is designing your presentation. It's not going to be a how-to on PowerPoint, but we will take a look at a few tips and advice on things you can do to make your presentation designs better. And then finally, we'll talk about you as a speaker. What you can do with just yourself to help make you a much better presenter. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about our audience. Well, the first thing that you need to know is that Cliff Atkinson in his book Beyond Bullet Points says that basically your audience is going to walk away with three learning outcomes after your presentation. The first possibility is they could walk away with, well, basically nothing. They didn't retain a single thing you had to say. The second option is what is called fragmented learning. It's basically where you present all this information, but technically they're only retaining just bits and pieces of it. They can't remember everything, just only a few portions. And then finally we have meaningful learning. It's where your audience is able to take each one of the things that you give, process that information, and then basically be able to apply it at a much later date. And that third type of learning, that meaningful learning, is what we're really going for with our presentations. So in order to come up with that, basically what you need to understand is how the memory works. Now there's three types of memory which are presented here. The first one is your sensory memory, and this is basically what you see in a presentation, the visuals and what you hear. And if you look to the far right, we have long-term memory. That's our storage container. That's our warehouse. We're going to put all this information to so that our students can basically recall it much later on and apply it. Now, in between sensory and long-term memory, we have working memory, which is basically short-term memory. Now, although it looks equal to the other two, unfortunately, though, it is very, very small. It is more like a funnel, and it cannot retain a whole lot. And so typically what happens in a multimedia presentation, whenever you're giving one, is that all this information is coming in through students through two channels. They're seeing all these graphics, all these images, illustrations, charts, they're seeing words, they're hearing you as a speaker. All this stuff is coming through and bombarding the working memory with so much information, not all of it can get through at any given time. So only certain pieces do. In fact, this typically results in that fragmented learning we mentioned earlier. So what's the solution? Well, because working memory is so small and can only handle so much at any given time, it is recommended that when you present your information on a slide, you reduce it to chunks of information, related information that's equal to each other, and don't put all this stuff on one slide at any given time. Slim it down and present it in chunks, because then as it's going through, it can move through the working memory much easier than it can if it's being bombarded. Remember, it's always easier to swallow bite-sized pieces of what you're eating as opposed to cramming your mouth full of food. Now, when we talk about this working memory, there's two channels at work. If we take our average student here with one tooth and present them a slide, the two channels at work are, number one, the visual channel. The visual channel is processing all the graphics, images, illustrations, and so forth. And there's also the verbal channel. And the verbal channel in a presentation actually has two things coming into it. Well, first off, you've probably already guessed, the information coming from you as a speaker, what you're saying, is being processed through the verbal channel, through the sensory of the ear. Now, what's also being processed through that channel is the text. And we'll show you this later on, but understand that text technically is nothing more than a bunch of visual symbols put together. The mind has to see that text first, and then the working memory turns it into something audible. I don't know, it's just the way the brain works, I guess. It's kind of like whenever you read a book or a novel, how the characters seem to have their own individual voices. Hopefully you're not hearing too many voices, after you read a novel, but anyway. All right, so the visual and verbal channel. Now, understanding both of these and how they work can help us avoid two types of effects with our presentations. The first one is the split attention effect. And the second one is the redundancy. We're going to take a look at each one of these. Here is a classic textbook example of the split attention effect. Inside of a textbook, a lot of times you'll have a diagram such as this, or an illustration. They'll have the explanation on the left side, or maybe the right, and then the visual on the other. Now, if you and I were reading this, we would have to look at the text and then look at the image for the visual interpretation. But what is the viewer really doing? He is jumping back and forth between the text and the visual. His attention is split between one and the other. He can't look at both at the same time. So what is it that we can do to make it easier? Well, what we can do is take bits and pieces of that information and migrate it over to the image, to the areas that it relates to, as seen above. So when you look at, for example, number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4, that pertinent information is aligned with its visual counterpart, making it easier to process, and now we can concentrate specifically on the image and understand its meaning. Now, whenever we apply that to our presentations, what happens is whenever we present a student with a slide such as this, hopefully none of you will, look at all that's going on. There is so much visual information just coming in through that one sensory area, through the eyes. You've got charts, you've got lightning bolts, you've got a hierarchy, you've got some weird looking graph down there near the bottom. All this is coming through. And at the same time, while they're looking at all that information, they're trying to listen to you speak all that verbal stuff as well as the text. They're reading and processing that text. And all of this stuff going in at the same time, remember, just like that working memory, it's being overloaded, which may cause your students to spontaneously combust. So what is the solution? Well, if you're going to be presenting, for example, something such as this, the thing that can help us reduce all that, reduce that split attention is get rid of the stuff that we don't need. So what we can do first is just get rid of all that text on the side. Because now what can happen is now you, as the speaker, you can talk about all that information that was there and present this simple graph. If you want to be even more specific and help reduce split attention even more, because technically students will still be reading the text up on the slide while trying to listen to you, you can actually get rid of all that text together. And so while you're doing this, you are presenting the information, the interpretation, which is going straight into the verbal, and the student is looking at this information which is coming through the visual. And so that way he doesn't have to split his attention. The student can constantly look at the visual and listen to you speak. And the working memory is more than able to reconcile smaller pieces of information. It's more than able to reconcile that visual with the verbal together because they both relate. Now, the other effect that we can have inside of a presentation is the redundancy effect. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to display several bullet points on here, and what I want you to do is, as I read through them, you read through them as well. You can read them out loud if you want, but as we go through it, whenever you get done, just see how much longer it takes for me to finish reading it than it did you. It's okay to read my bullet points from the screen. Bullet points tell me exactly what to say. Bullet points tell my audience exactly what to read while I say it, and bullet points make me feel safe. At this point, if you are doing this type of presentation, you're basically using your presentation as a teleprompter, and you don't want that. Now, when we think about this, now keep in mind that as I was reading it and you were reading it, what was going on? Well, you got done sooner than I did because you were processing that information faster than I was reading it. And so let's talk about what this does to the brain, the redundancy effect. So when we take that exact same student, keep in mind that they are looking or they are hearing the spoken text. You heard me read it, and all that is directly going into the verbal channel. It's processing that information. But at the same time as I'm reading that information or as I'm speaking, you're looking at the exact same thing that I'm saying, that redundant information. And so what's happening is as you're reading that text while I'm speaking it, first you have to look at the symbols. Every single letter is a symbol. When those letters combine together, they form a word. And then all that text as it's being seen is then processed into the verbal channel. Okay, again, text will start out in visual and then move to the verbal. So what's happening here is as I'm speaking, you're looking at the exact same thing that I'm saying. And so you have this information coming into the exact same channel, that verbal channel, at two different speeds. Basically discombobulating our student and unfortunately, yes, spontaneously combusting again. So what can we do to fix that? Well, when you think about things like this, your typical, again, your typical slide bullet points, percentages, or whatever else, get rid of the redundant information. There is no reason for you to speak this information if I, as a viewer, can read it. Either say it or show it, but don't do both. The viewer can only concentrate on either you or the slide. So what we can do instead is get rid of that redundant information so we don't have to bombard the verbal channel twice, is let me, as the speaker, say those points while the viewer looks at the graph. I provide verbal meaning for the visual that they see. This helps reduce the overload that the working memory is going to get. Because basically when you are presenting, understand that less is more. The less that you overload the working memory, the more learning can take place. All right, so now that we've talked about our audience, let's go and talk about basically your presentations. And understand that presentations do not necessarily equal PowerPoint, okay? It's not about the tool that you use, it's about connecting. And presentations typically will have about 4 things put together. Number 1, you've got the content. You've got a nice structure. Everything flows from beginning to end. It's all wrapped up in a nice little package. And then it's delivered by you as a speaker. And what's nice is that whenever all 4 of these things are working well, good content, good flow, looks really nice, and you're just doing an outstanding job. When we've got the green on everything, we've got a fantastic presentation taking place, an opportune moment for meaningful learning to go. But if any one of these is slightly off, for example, you've got great content, good subject matter, good message, it looks really nice, you do a good job speaking, but the structure, it flows rather awkward. The presentation, whenever people walk out of it, they may not result in meaningful learning. That broken link may result in a bit of fragmented learning instead. So 4 things to think about as you're designing your presentation. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, number 1, what's the purpose? What is the goal of your presentation? Because that's going to help determine how you lay things out, what visuals you're going to find, and how you're going to present this to your audience. And speaking of audience, you need to keep them in mind as that purpose. What does your audience already know about this topic? What don't they know? What do you want them to be able to do with this topic once you are done with that? And remember, always think about how they process information. The second thing you want to think about is how you're going to map it. It's that structure, it's that flow. Every presentation, you should do it in a way that gets your audience to its right destination. And I laugh because a lot of times I think about GPSs, where you plug in the destination and you hope that your car is going to get you there. But unfortunately, every now and then it will take you to some road that does not exist, a road that has changed, or will basically tell you, turn right here. So you turn right again, you turn right, turn right one more time. Basically, you're going around in a big circle. You know, no one likes to do that with their GPS. No one likes to do that inside of a presentation. Get them from point A to point B. You control what they're going to see along the way of that route. You're controlling what they're going to see along that journey. Get them to their destination. So a few things to think about as you're building that content is, number one, think of a nice introduction or an icebreaker, something to introduce the topic to them to get them thinking instead of just jumping right into your presentation, your slideshow. You know, at the beginning of this one, we sort of related it to a movie theater. You know, instead of seeing a movie, you instead see a script. That is a great way to sort of help lead your audience into thinking about that content ahead of time. Basically, by that introduction, if you're good about it, it can already begin to recall what they currently know, bring that up to the forefront. The second thing is you want to basically go ahead and list, kind of talk about what this presentation is going to do. What's the objective of it? What do you want your audience to be able to do when they're done? And when you think about this presentation, I didn't use bullet points, but I said that there were three things that we were going to cover. The first part was the audience. The second part we're on, which is designing your presentation. And then the third part is you as the speaker. And then, of course, once you've got those objectives out, you've got everything laid out, break all those main points into chunks. There is no reason to put as much information as you can on one slide. Do not worry about how many slides you have in your presentation. You'd be surprised, but I think this presentation has like 50 or 60 slides in the way that it's built. You focus on those chunks. Get that information, strip it out, remove redundancy, and break those main points up into bite-sized pieces that your audience can understand better. You'll notice that, for example, when we talked about split attention and redundancy, we did not put all that information onto one slide. We spread it out so that it would be more easily processed, I should say, and giving you bite-sized pieces along the way. And then finally, make sure that you have a closing. You don't want to leave a cliffhanger. People want to know that hey, at the beginning of the presentation, when you introduced it, when you gave those objectives, you said, I would be here at this destination. And so whenever you hit that closing, you want to make sure that your audience has arrived at their learning destination and that they feel complete whenever they walk out. So make sure you close it. Now, the next part is the actual putting it together. And when we talk about this, there's just a few things I want to get you thinking about. The first part is, whenever you're communicating visually, think about these three things. Fonts, or your text, how you handle that, working with images, and of course the colors that you choose. So let's take a look at each one of these real briefly. First off, when we talk about fonts, if you're a graphic designer or have ever talked to graphic designers, a lot of them will probably tell you that fonts are clothes that words wear. So you always want to make sure that your words are wearing the right clothes to the party. Sorry, that's a lot to say. It's kind of like basically you're picking out a costume for your text. And whenever you're doing that, it's real important because you have to understand fonts have personalities. As an example, when you think about the word bank, is this an appropriate costume? Is this an appropriate outfit for the word bank, and why? Maybe this particular font, when you look at it, helps the bank look, very traditional, looks established. Times New Roman has a very, it feels like something that you can trust, that it's been around for a while. But what about this font? Does this font fit the word bank just as well? It can. Maybe it's sort of like what Bank of America does. This makes the bank feel like it's more up to times, that it's not so traditional, that it's very modern. But at the same time, if you notice, it's somewhat thick, so, hey, it looks somewhat stable. So this is an appropriate font for your text. But what about this? Absolutely not. This is probably what banks, we feel like they do with our money, but you wouldn't put this on a business card. It looks like a kid's bank. That is an inappropriate way. Inappropriate font for the text. And so whenever you're presenting, whether it's headlines or whatever else, make sure you're thinking about the font that you're using, because whenever you're using fonts, colors, and visuals, these are like people on a team, and you want to make sure that all of them have the same goal, all of them have the same focus, that even though each one will have its own personality, you want to make sure that it's meshing with your overall content. And believe it or not, fonts can be a distraction. You don't want to do an entire presentation on technology with a Comic Sans type font. You know, those two don't really seem to go together. In fact, I won't lie, but I'm actually part of the group that says ban Comic Sans. I have nothing against it personally. I just have something against those who use it inappropriately. Like I said, if your Comic Sans looks like a nice kids font, and it's great for elementary school, but it is not good for things like Fortune 500 companies, technology, all this other stuff. Fonts have personality, so make sure you've got the right one matching your presentation, your content. So other things to think about with your text is whenever you're deciding on a font is whether you're going to be using a serif, like what you see on the left, which is typically like Times New Roman. It has those feet on it. Or you're going to be using a sans serif font. And my recommendation is, if you can always use the serif font on the left for things like headlines, whenever the text is going to be big, because it can read better. But if possible, try to use the one on the right, that type of text, things like Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, things that don't have those feet. And now why? Well, it's because if for whatever reason you need to reduce the text on a screen, take a look. Which one is more visible? If you look, the one on the right seems to have a little bit more weight. It seems more solid. And that's because when you look at the text on the left, those thin and thick marks of serif fonts, it's the thin ones that seem to begin to disappear. And unlike a serif font, I'm sorry, I'm getting all confused. Unlike the sans serif font on the right, where it basically has that solid structure throughout the entire text. So again, the font on the left is a serif font, things like Times New Roman. The one on the right is a sans serif, which means without serif. It is things like Arial, Verdana, Helvetica, things like that. All right, so as we move on, let's talk about text size, because text size is not just about how readable it is, but it can also convey certain meanings. Very small text is very, very quiet. Text is too big, just seems to shout at your audience, and that's just too much. You don't want to scream at them. So whenever you're working with the headline, find one that's comfortable. People ask, well, what's an appropriate point size? And to be honest, when you go back and view the website, it can vary. Every font is not. I could have a list of fonts and have them all the same size, but they'll look different. What I typically have told folks, or what some others may suggest, is don't go below 24 to 28. But the nice thing is, if you're not using as much text on your slide, then you can actually go a little bit bigger. But don't go too big. That's what we're kind of trying to emphasize here. Or too small. Make sure it's readable but not shouting, in other words. All right, so when we talk about text case, this is something I love to do. I'm a very informal person, and so a lot of times you'll notice that a lot of my emails, the way I sign my signature and everything else. Formal, we take the first letter of the sentence and we capitalize it. And then, of course, if you have anything important, you make it all caps. So again, small ways that you can communicate through text case. Now, when we talk about communicating through images, these can be things like photographs. You can use illustrations. You can also use charts and graphs. And when we talk about images, the one thing that you need to think about whenever you're picking an image out is that it's often said that I always mess this up, but an image is either worth 1,000 words or can speak 1,000 words. And so if you're going to choose an image, you want to make sure that it's saying the right ones. And so, for example, let's say that we have this type of saying, or this is something you might say in a presentation. Nursing is rewarding in that we help others through difficult times. Now, when you think about that, think about, what's the best image I can use for that? Which image will help emphasize or speak those same type of words? Is it this one? That's awfully cute. Or would this one be more appropriate? So again, you're looking for the image that speaks the right words. The rhinoceros is, yeah, that's kind of cute, but how do we know that that little guy isn't holding the big man down? I don't know. So maybe the one on the left is more appropriate, and that's the one saying the right thing. And so, in fact, we wouldn't even have to have these words up there. We could say those words and just simply have the image. That way people view the imagery, and we provide the verbal interpretation to it. Now, finally, let's just mention color real quick. Obviously, on the left side, you have these are your cool colors. These are your calming colors. Greens, blues, and purples. And then, of course, you have your very high energy colors, yellow, red, and orange. There's a reason why hospitals use the colors on the left and not the colors on the right. Can you imagine going and being pulled into an emergency room that has red colored walls where people are walking around in bright orange or yellow scrubs? Yeah, your anxiety level would probably go up, as well as your blood pressure. Believe it or not, the color red can help stimulate that blood pressure. The colors on the right are stimulants. They stimulate appetite. This is why a lot of fast food industries use those colors. So if you don't want to use cool or warm colors, you could always use monotone colors, monochromatic. And regardless, for example, it doesn't have to be black, black and white, or grayscale. You can take any one color and simply use different shades of it. But one thing you need to know that when you are using color on a slide, if you have any element, the darker the element gets, the more forward it seems to come, while lighter elements seem to fade backwards. And when you are thinking about using a color on your slide, you want to make sure that you're using in regards to your background and your foreground. If your background is very light in nature, for example, white, which color is the one that shows up the best? That's right, the darker red. And so that's the one you want to use. Lighter backgrounds, we use darker colored text. Now if we do the reverse, if we take darker backgrounds, we want to use lighter colored text. Again, all of its readability. You want to make sure that you have nice contrast so that people in your audience can view and see the information. All right, so we've talked about those three things, and let's come down to the final one, and let's talk about basically you as a presenter. So we've talked about purpose, we've talked about the structure, the flow, that map, and we've also talked about designing your presentation using those text, visuals, and colors, and now it's time for you as the speaker. So what are things that you can do as a speaker to help your presentation? Well, the first thing is relax. We all know that people get nervous and everything else. Calm down. You're going to get through this. Everyone does. Supposedly what public speaking is the number one, fear that most people have. Well, just relax. It'll all be over in an hour. Unless it's a 3-hour lecture, then it'll be over in 3 hours. But whatever it is, find a way to calm yourself down before you give a presentation. You don't want to be nervous, sweating, or anything else because you'll have a tendency to talk fast. You might do things you don't normally do. So find whatever breathing technique, mantra, whatever will help calm your nerves. But I will say that typically why most people are not relaxed when they do a presentation is because they're so nervous about forgetting what they're going to say. And so, if you practice may not make perfect, but it will help make good presentations. The more familiar you are with the content, the easier it is for you to present. And if you're treating your slide, your presentation as a teleprompter, that's not good. So always take that time, spend it, practice, be good at what it is you're going to say, design your presentation correctly, and you'll probably feel a lot more calmer going into it than you would if you hadn't. All right, so a few other things. Number one, make some eye contact with your audience. You want to make sure that you're looking at them. Don't look at your screen all the time because that shows you're not interested, or that again you're using it as a teleprompter. You may also want to divide the room up into 3 sections, and you'll speak to one side, make eye contact with them, then in the middle, then on the right side. So you're constantly making this moving action, connecting with people inside the audience, because that's what it's about. You want to have that connection, and eye contact can help. Now, understand you will have a few folks in your presentation who are going to be bored to tears or just disagree with you. Don't focus on those individuals. If you do see people who seem slightly confused, stop and perhaps rephrase something. Don't pull them out saying, I'm sorry, you there, you don't look like you're getting it. That wouldn't be good. But notice those things. Make that eye contact. See how people are responding. And then, of course, look for those who are being positive in their response. Those are the ones that you want to take a look at throughout your presentation, because number one, it'll help keep you being less nervous. But one thing I can say about eye contact, do not stare at the same person all the time. You're not there for a date, and that may unfortunately be what it feels like if you're looking at them all the time. So move around the room or make eye contact throughout the room. The other one is your facial expressions. If you're excited about your topic, it needs to show. You don't want to be, that stoic individual that has no expressions. You don't want to be Spock. You want to be Captain Kirk when you're up there on the stage, talking. And, if it's something excited, man, let us see it inside your facial expression. If it's something somber, we can see it reflected inside of your eyes. But, there's just something to say about facial expressions. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you have to smile all the time. Obviously, if we're talking about the bubonic plague and that kind of stuff, that's probably not an appropriate time to smile all the time. But use the appropriate facial expressions. They can add to your presentation. Keep in mind, the slide is not the only visual your audience is looking at. Of course, gestures, which I cannot demonstrate here, but as you are doing your presentation, using your hands to emphasize moments throughout the slide. Some people, we have normal gestures. We talk with our hands on a regular basis. And, if it's common, then it's no big deal. But some folks, they use it to emphasize how big something was. Talk to a fisherman. They never just stick their hands in the pocket when you ask them how big the fish was they caught. Boy, they whip those hands down. They're like, it was this big, when in reality it was probably about 2 or 3 times smaller. But, you want to use those to emphasize the content you're presenting. And keep in mind, that's another form of visual representation. If you're talking about something, you can use those hands as another visual. One of the things I don't recommend is some people, if you're very nervous and you do a lot of hand wringing or whatever else, don't put your hands in your pocket. I don't think that's a very suitable alternative, because then you start moving your hands in your pocket, and you're swinging back and forth. It just looks really awkward and stuff. What I will tell a few folks is that, if that's the case, then simply put your hands behind your back and walk around like that. That way you still remain open and you don't look awkward on the stage. And then, of course, your posture, your body orientation. Now, keep in mind that, stand up. I think in a brief message, I can tell you to stand up straight. Make sure that you're always facing the audience whenever you're speaking. You never want to turn your back on them. Keep your hands out of your pocket. Keep your hands open, not necessarily crossed like this individual. The reason is if you're standing up straight, you appear confident. If you're facing the audience, it's easier to make that connection with them, to see them. It gets you relying less on your slide. And if you've got your hands open, if they're not crossed, it indicates to your audience that you're not a closed individual, that you're someone who's approaching them. So it just makes it easier to talk to your audience, because sometimes an audience person will end up mimicking what they see you doing. You'd be surprised. You see a very excited person up on a stage, a lot of times your facial expressions are almost mimicking theirs. And it can be the same thing with the body orientation. If a gentleman is walking across the stage talking the entire time with his arms crossed, he may seem like a very cold or person doesn't want to kind of be there. Pretty soon you find your audience members doing the same. And then, of course, your proximity. Make sure that I'm sorry, these are all bullet points. It's much easier to demonstrate live inside of a presentation. But when it comes to your proximity, you want to make sure that you're staying about 3 to 5 feet away from folks. Everyone likes their 3 to 5 feet of personal space. Honor that. Do not encroach upon that. The closer you get, the more cautionary they become. Some faculty love to walk among the students through the rows of the classes, the rows of desks, and everything else, and that's okay. It does probably perk up a bit of anxiety with your students, because now you're getting closer to them, but the fact that you're moving on helps relieve a lot of that anxiety, that you're still moving around. Now, if you happen to stand in front of one particular individual 1 to 2 feet away the entire time, yeah, that person's no longer concentrating on the slideshow. They're focusing more on you. And then, of course, your attire. What I tell folks is, hey, dress for the occasion. Make sure that you're wearing the clothes for both the venue and your audience. If you're talking to a Fortune 500 company, blue jeans and a t-shirt is probably not appropriate. What I tell most folks, if you want to play it safe, hey, go with a suit or business casual, and you'll probably be okay. But always think about who you're speaking to. I went to a conference one time and watched a presenter, it was in Florida, and he presented in shorts and a Hawaiian shirt while he played the guitar. But you know what? It helped fit his message. And the rest of us were in blue jeans and everything else, and so that was okay. But always think about, the other thing to think about is that typically when you go, you represent a larger organization. And so you always want to make sure that you're representing the best whenever you go. And then, of course, your voice. And this one I just want to take a few moments and talk about just real quick. When we talk about your voice is probably the most important tool that you have whenever you do speak. Because it's, think about all those great presentations you may have been to before PowerPoint was around. I know for some of us that may not be. That's too difficult to realize, but yes, it hasn't always been there. But yet we've had instructors in our lives that were fantastic presenters. Just something about the way they spoke. It just resonated with you. And so you can use that good voice. People like Morgan Freeman have a fantastic voice. That's why they use him for a lot of voiceovers or narration for documentaries. So when you talk about voice, the thing to keep in mind is the volume. You want to find that right volume that reaches the entire audience. Always speak to the person, nearest the back, if you can. If you've only got people in the first 3 rows, you don't need to be shouting. But at the same time, you don't need to be really quiet. You want to make sure that everyone can hear what you have to say without shouting at them the entire time, because that just gets old. It just seems like you're one angry individual. I don't know. All right, so the other thing that you can think about when you're using your voice is the one thing that gets most couples, fighting. You've probably heard it in some type of relationship. It's not what you say, but how you say it. It's that tone of voice that you put with it. Do you have a very jovial tone when you speak? Is it a very, just sort of casual, informal? Is it more militaristic whenever you speak to people? Or, I don't know, what is this, psychotic maybe? So think about that tone of voice, because people will respond differently to that. You want a tone of voice that's going to be encouraging, that draws your people in, not scares them half to death. And then, of course, your pitch, your vocal pitch. Okay, now, I don't know how many people have ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off with Ben Stein, the anyone, type thing, but, you definitely do not want to have the same vocal pitch as a dead person's EKG. It did not want that monotone going the entire time. Instead, you want to make sure that your presentation, when you speak, it has life. Natural speaking has ups, it's got downs, depending on the context that you're talking about. And so if it's very exciting or very important, obviously your voice is going to go up. And if it's not, just speak normal. Or sometimes if it's, you can always sort of get a little bit quieter. There's those peaks. It's up and down, but it's not a constant up and down. I once took an airplane ride, and I kid you not. And the stewardess was, "And we welcome you to the I won't say the airport. Although I probably gave it away. Airport. And it was just like this up and down when they spoke. And it was like, oh wow, I'm getting motion sickness. So anyway, let's move on before I get an email from that person. And the pace at which you speak. By no doubt, when you first start presenting, you're always going to speak at a very rushed tone. But keep in mind, try to slow yourself down, because, again, think about how long a normal sentence lasts. Speak normally. Do the best that you can, because what happens is if you speak too fast, everything just begins to run together, and no one can understand what you're saying. You're either speaking too fast, or you're slurring because you had too many drinks before you presented. Or at least that's what they'll think. And then, of course, if you talk too slow, it just drags on and on and on. Similar to the professor from Paper Chase, if you've ever seen that movie. And finally, after we talk about pace, there's only one thing left for you as a speaker that most people fear the most, not just speaking, but unfortunately that's right. It's the attack of all those questions you get. I don't know. We get so afraid what people may ask of us if we don't know the answer. Well, that's okay. You don't have to know everything, and be willing to admit that. If you can answer those things that you are comfortable with, so be confident that you'll be able to take those questions. But if someone challenges you, simply, first off, if they ask you a question, repeat the question so everyone can hear it, and then listen to their statement, or give your statement on what you do know. And what you don't know, simply tell them, hey, you raise a really interesting point. I think, tell you what, why don't you give me your email address or your number, and if I can find some information on it, I'll get that to you. So at least that way you are addressing it. And what's be nice, if you actually follow through, it will help you the next time you give that presentation, just in case a similar question comes up. What you don't want to do is I'm sorry, what was the I can't I can't breathe. I'm gonna have to leave. Thank you folks for coming. Walk out coughing. You can't do that. You also can't start answering the question and simply faint, because what's going to happen is whenever they revive you, the same guys there, do you feel better? Yes. So what do you think about my question? You're going to have to answer it anyway. You know what? You're going to deal with those. And one thing I can say, if you deal with someone that is very challenging to you, who keeps, you can understand where it's no longer a question, it's becoming more of a critique. Simply, I would just tell them, say, sir, ma'am, listen, we really want to try to address as many questions as we can, but perhaps after the presentation, you and I can talk some more. And just let them talk to you and so forth and go, well, that's great. Thank you so much, but I need to move on. And so anyway, so there's always a way to deal with it. Just deal with it in a way of respect and stuff. But listen to those questions, because it'll help drive you to go back and revisit some of your material and help you become better. And then for the next time, you'll know what to say. And so that's pretty much it for presenting professionally, kind of everything in a nutshell. And one of the things I do want to also advise you is, if you get a chance to go to and visit the website, which if you're at Spartanburg Community College here, you've gotten plenty of emails about, but you can also find the information there underneath teaching strategies and presentation tips, where I go into a lot more detail about some of the things presented here. So I hope you'd enjoy it, and I hope it'll change the way that you do things at a conference as well as inside your classroom.